good evening is what I was meaning to say there. My name is Shona Common. I'm one of the co-producers for the Architecture Fringe, and I'm here together with Louise Butler and Cam Chan of the Architecture Fringe too. Welcome to Practice Roundtable 1, Unlearning Architecture Looking In, which forms part of the Architecture Fringe 2021 core programme. Thank you again for joining us. The theme for this year's Architecture Fringe is unlearning, and we invite you to unlearn with us, to interrogate your own beliefs, biases and behaviours in order to acknowledge how the world really is, to then reimagine how it could be. The Practice project seeks to explore current conditions of practice for architects and those working with or for the built environment, and through a process of unlearning and building anew, generate speculative proposals for future practice, its values, systems and modes of operation. Tonight is the first of 2 roundtable discussions as we look inward to practice, examining the methods, ethics, culture and structures and how the profession operates. I'm now going to hand over to Louisa, if you want to take over.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, we're delighted to be joined this evening by our inspiring provocateurs, Joss Boys, Tumpa, Husna, Yasmin Fellows, and Aska and Kerry from UVW-SAW, who will each contribute a short provocation and engage in a discussion with our facilitator for the evening, Christina Gaiger, the president of the Royal Corporation of Architects in Scotland. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. We'd like to remind you that this event is being recorded and will also be uploaded to our YouTube channel if you want to watch it again. This is a Zoom meeting, which we felt was the best platform to make it feel like we're all together. So it's up to you whether you want to leave your video on or off, but we'd ask you to be muted throughout. Also, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen during the course of this evening to share any comments, questions or share resources with everybody. We've also have live closed captions available during this event, so click the CC button at the bottom if you wish to use this function. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Christina.
Thank you, Shona and Louisa, and hello everyone. It's absolutely lovely to actually be able to see all of your faces on the screen, and thank you so much for joining us in this virtual space this evening. So as Louisa kindly introduced me, my name is Christina Gaiger. I'm a fervent advocate for active travel and sustainable retrofit, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm also an architect practicing at Helen Lucas Architects in Edinburgh, and as Louisa mentioned, president of the Royal Corporation of Architects in Scotland, known as the RIS. Tonight, however, I wish to unlearn as I take on the role of facilitator following the kind invitation from the Architecture Fringe team. And I really look forward this evening to speculating, testing and reimagining with you all tonight. So we're really lucky, as it's already been mentioned, to have 3 inspiring provocateurs with us. And we'll start things off this evening by hearing from them individually and with questions between each other before moving on to facilitate a discussion with everyone here. We really want to involve everyone in this virtual room tonight to try and get different voices into the conversation. So before I pass over to Joss, I wanted to kind of start off an initial discussion essentially this evening, because we all felt the panel and myself in a previous discussion that we actually wanted to start things off with a question for everyone here. So what's something to bear in mind and or answer whenever you feel that you want to during the event by using the chat function. The team will also pop the question into the chat box, so there's no need to scribble anything down quickly as I read this out. So the question is, what is the most important thing do you think we should unlearn in practice? For example, if there was one change you could make, what would it be? So leaving you with that as we start off this evening, I'll now pass over to Joss. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Really nice to be here, and it's kind of exciting and funny to be the first one to speak, but I am going to share some slides with using different techniques, I think, across the different groups. And what I would like to do is take this opportunity really to just reflect on some of the things that I've been involved with and which I feel connect to both the fantastic other women in the room here and speakers, and to this notion of unlearning practice. So my background is I studied architecture, although I've practiced it only a small amount. I've done much more research and journalism and writing and mainly design activism. So I was one of the co-founders of Matrix, feminist design practice in the 1980s, and more recently I co-founded and co-director of something called the Disordinary Architecture Project, which is what I plan to talk about most in this short conversation. So when I was thinking about, I often get asked about what are the relationships between getting involved with Matrix and what was explicitly a kind of feminist way of working in the 1980s and 90s, and why I'm involved much more in issues around disability, access and inclusion now. And I feel like there are kind of 4 threads, overlapping threads, that I'll just briefly discuss, and you can see them on the screen: challenging norms, starting from difference, shifting practices, and the notion of collective care. And what I normally do when we're in a room, a real room, is one of the things is to start in this notion of deconstructing norms, of challenging norms, is to think about this space of the lecture. It's already challenged. We're getting used to this new mode within the virtual space, and actually Disordinary Architecture have been developing some ways of also doing that differently. But what I used to do when we were actually meeting in lecture theatres was to use the opportunity to talk through what it is that a lecture is and the assumptions that are behind it, and who is valued in that process and who is not. So there's an obvious hierarchy. I'm speaking, you're expected just to listen and not to interrupt. You're expected not to make odd noises or to stand up. You're expected to sit quite often in very uncomfortable chairs, just staring at the screen. And one of the things we often do to break that in real space is to end up with a lecture where everybody's lying on the floor, and that's organized through stages. And we do a similar version actually quite often online, but I'm not going to do it today. And that comes from Disordinary Architecture is a group of disabled artists. It's disability led, and the idea is that the creativity of disabled artists is a very good way of really looking for new modes of practice around access and inclusion. This is one of the artists that works with us, Aaron Williamson, and he does a fantastic, very humorous, he's a live artist, and he does a lot of work around the notion. He's done a series of things on the notion of the lecture, the collapsing lecture, with the aim of basically seeing if you set up a lecture space and then you don't do a lecture, how long will people stay there before they finally get anxious and start to leave? And it's normally about 25 minutes. And that connects to other ways that the artists work with architects, with practitioners, with educators, with students, which is around this thing about who those spaces support. If you're somebody who can't, sitting upright in those very uncomfortable chairs is problematic, or if the background noise or not really being able to hear the speaker or slides that you can't read, all those things are assumed that you just have to put up with it. When Aaron was a student, a deaf student, there were no accommodations made for him, and luckily he found it very funny to watch lectures where he couldn't hear what was being said. On the screen is Rachel Mezagur, who works around the idea of changing those spaces so that they're also spaces of rest and contemplation. And that's some work we've done around that. This is somebody called Jess Tom, who some of you may know, who's been working with Battersea Arts Centre to make it a complete relaxed venue. So to actually really rethink all those relationships between different kinds of body minds and the spaces that we occupy. How can we make theatre spaces that are actually a fantastic experience for everybody? And you can see that work on the Battersea Arts Centre's website. So that's a kind of notion of just one example of challenging norms and how it has direct spatial and architectural implications. Another is this idea of starting from difference. This is something that does tie back to matrix in some ways, and we can talk about that if people want to, but also I think there's a lot of the other speakers will have really interesting things to say. So starting from difference is this idea that too often, I would say, in architectural practice, in the way that we operate, and why one of the things we need to unlearn is we don't really think about, if we're practitioners, we don't really think about our own bodies. Our own body mind is the expression Margaret Price uses from a disability studies scholar. We don't think of practice as embodied, even though it is. And I'm talking particularly if you're white, if you're cishet, there's all sorts of things where you don't have to pay attention. And for me, there's been really interesting work, this is from the 70s, about gendered space and how being female can sometimes feel like, this is Sheila Rowbottom, lumbering around ungainly-like in borrowed concepts, which did not fit the shape we feel ourselves to be. And a more recent version of that from disability studies scholar Rosemary Garland-Thompson is a misfit occurs when world fails flesh in the environment one encounters. So we're really interested, what do I mean by starting from difference? This notion of fitting and misfitting for me is a really vital starting point for design, for thinking about design and for thinking about practice and how we practice. So if you fit, I'd like you all to think about this. Fitting, and we all fit in some ways quite often, and some people fit more than others, but if you fit pretty smoothly with your immediate material and social environment, you don't really need to take notice of it. Nothing gets in your way, nothing jumps up to bite you, and you have this kind of assumption of your own unproblematic place in the world. So life is easy, you know, relatively easy, but also it's not enhancing your creativity. If you misfit and you have a non-normal body mind, you don't fit conventional stereotypes. It can be very frustrating, it can be damaging, but at the same time, it can increase your creativity. It means you have to pay attention to how you negotiate places and social encounters. So that feels like a really good place to start. In disability studies, people often talk about non-compliant bodies, unruly bodies, and I really like this idea that if you design from the misfits, from the outliers, you're potentially designing from a very creative space. And that sense of the way in which misfitting is fantastic as a notion to me because it's relational. It's about who you are, who you're with, what you're doing, and how the spaces around you do or don't fit. And that's both the built environment itself, but it's also the spaces of practice. Where those are disabling or enabling changes through time, changes through context. But the fact that these things go on happening is something that really part of unlearning practice is us really facing up to this. And disordinary architecture looks at that through all sorts of different techniques. We have ways of thinking about our bodies and changing our bodies in space to try and explore the complexities of starting from difference. And we work in lots of different ways with disabled artists as part of that kind of rethinking and reimagining what spaces might be like. In terms of shifting practices, I think the others will talk more about, there'll be much more to say about this, but for me, coming from the kind of alternative practices that were going on in the 1980s, the new architecture movement. This is Slate magazine, which was their magazine. They were a version of a group that were trying to unionize architecture. And the poster on the other side is from the Architects Revolutionary Council, which was trying to really challenge the way in which architecture was, and architects tended to side with money against in this case, grassroots campaigns and community organization. And one of the things that Matrix did as part of that in terms of rethinking those practices was to operate in a very not just to do design, but to do, we wrote a book, we wrote lots of different papers, and we we had a lot of different events, and we were involved in organising a architectural foundation course for women to come into architecture and building. We work differently with clients. Again, these things happen more now, but working with models, working with very straightforward ways of making it possible for clients to engage with the spaces that were being designed. This is Dalston Children's Centre. This is a photograph from some of the conversations around the Jaganari Asian Women's Centre. And this, for example, was a brick picnic where the client group went off on a picnic to look at different colours of bricks and discuss what bricks and what mortar they wanted for their scheme. I'm not going to talk about this because there's quite a lot more to go. But one of the things, as you can see from these pictures going by, is we could even represent people differently in our drawings. Maybe we should think about that a bit more. This is Aaron Williamson again, working with students at the Architectural Association, where the project was completely different to a kind of standard design project. And these were the kinds of outputs that the students produced. That was with Manajay Verghese and Inigo Mins. And this is an ongoing project, which is a foundation course for blind and visually impaired people to be architects. And rather than adjusting, somehow teaching them how to behave like architects normally do by trying to teach them or teach orthographic drawing and the like, we were really interested in how you might develop alternative kinds of design methods that would actually enrich mainstream architecture. Chris Downey, a blind architect from the States. I won't talk about these, but this was actually about, we talked about whether you could design a space through performance and audio descriptions. This is Sade Abdul and Mandy Redvers-Rowe experimenting with that way of designing. This is Duncan Murding with one of the students, a blind student, making work in the workshop. So I just wanted to end really with this notion of collective care. And for me, there is a real, I can hear my cat mewing, but I don't know if you can. There is a real fantastic, it is about where we unlearn and where we learn from. And I think I just wanted to note that I have learned so much from disability activism, disability arts, disability studies, scholarship. And in terms of us thinking about access and inclusion differently, not just having these incredibly banal templates from the building regulations that we stick into schemes. This is a project called Access is Love by the Disability Visibility Project, which is about thinking about how enabling access is actually, has to be done. It's always complex. It always has lots of contradictions. It has to be done through collective action. It can be done through crowdsourcing. It can be done through all sorts of ways of bringing lots of different voices together and using that as a way to inform design or to inform events. This is Mapping Access by Amy Hamray, a fantastic person in really exploring these kind of participatory methods that do build on crowdsourcing and do build on this idea that collective care is actually, it's a collective responsibility we all have. It's not just up to disabled people or other disadvantaged or underrepresented groups. And in that responsibility, we need to have ways of listening to a whole range of voices and then dealing with that, accepting and dealing with that, and enjoying that as a creative process, not just hoping that we can have some universal solution. And here is some other examples. In this case, this was crowdsourcing the whole set of places where just a small ramp would make it much easier for somebody who used a wheelchair or a mobility scooter to get around and about. This is in Toronto, but this project was done, it's by Sarah Hendren, and it was done in several other cities too. So finally, I wanted to say, as part of that unlearning, I'm not going to go through each of these references, but I feel like there is so much out there. We really need to understand when we're looking at disability, for example, that the regulations we have come out of a huge process of campaigning and of it being marginalised in particular ways, so that they're quite problematic. And the amount of really brilliant work that's going on in that field about access, about inclusion, that's very intersectional and richly so, is something that I really hope some people will feel they can engage with. You'll be able to see these slides at a later date if you want to pick up these references. And that's just some examples and some references of the work that I've done and that Disordinary Architecture has done. So that's me.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I'm so tempted to ask everyone to lie down, but I'm trying to resist the urge. I mean, even the concept, you know, a change like that to the dynamic in a lecture, you know, your starting comment is absolutely, you know, very thought-provoking and just challenges you to think differently about how we interact. So right from the get-go, absolutely fascinating, Joss, thank you. So we have a question from Tumpa actually for you, just to expand on that a little bit. Tumpa, can I invite you to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Joss. Wow, that was such a rich variety of projects and experiences. Thanks for sharing that. My question is actually, it's framed around your sort of the feminist approach to practice. So while looking inward and exploring the current conditions of practice for architects, those working with or in the built environment, with the hierarchical management structure in practices, and which often leads to a non-collaborative working conditions, could you please discuss the issues surrounding women in practice, the relationship of women to the architectural profession, and to the procurement of architecture?
That's fantastic. It's a huge question. And I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask it of. I would say, first of all, that in the early days, when a kind of a group of women, 70 or 80 women it was, really came together in response to feeling like, although the new architecture movement was doing amazing things, somehow the women were still making the tea. And that group split quite, you know, amicably into a group of women who were really interested in changing within the profession, and a group of women who felt like we had to just do the whole thing completely differently. So Matrix was the second of those, and it means that my experience of mainstream practice, well, I don't even have an experience of mainstream practice, so it's not, there are so many women and colleagues doing really great work in that area. But I think in terms of working collectively, I think that Matrix was an early experiment. I mean, there were quite a lot of collectives at that time, different sorts of building practices, different sorts of, there were things called technical aid centres, which were like an architectural version of legal aid. So there was a lot going on. And I think the Matrix, what's very clear is some decisions were made about how to operate collectively around meetings and an equality of responsibility. And there were decisions like that everybody should be paid the same. And actually, as it played out through time, those ways of understanding working collectively had difficulties as well as, you know, things that worked out well. So if you were, you know, a lot of us were part of that gang of white middle-class women, young women, who were coming into university for the first time post-war. And London was quite cheap, and we had, so we had the privilege of being able to operate under those terms. But there were many women who didn't join Matrix because they couldn't afford it. And there were women, particularly women of colour, who basically ended up taking 2 jobs because they couldn't afford to live that way because they didn't have, you know, money behind them. So that's a very long answer, but it's like there's a lot to learn, I think, about how not to be a collective, as well as the kind of value of collective working.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. And I think there's probably lots of threads we're going to pick up on, I think, throughout the discussion this evening, hopefully. So I'm just going to remind everyone, because I can see a vacant chat, so trying to pull everyone into the virtual room, of the question that we asked at the beginning. So what is the most important thing do you think we should unlearn in practice? And for example, if there was one change you could make, what would it be? So maybe following Joss's discussion there and kind of conversation about work and practice and fitting, I think is appropriate. Is there anything that springs to mind? Let us know and we'll pick it up in the discussion later. And also, if there's any questions that spring to mind as people are talking, please pop them in the chat and we'll pick them up in the discussion with the room later on. So I'd like to invite our next provocateur to the floor, essentially. So we have Kerry and Asker from UVW-SAW, the Section of Architectural Workers. So Kerry and Asker.
Hello, I'll start off, but Asker and I are going to rotate throughout this next section. By means of a quick introduction, United Voices of the World, Section of Architectural Workers, or SAW for short, is a member-led trade union of architectural workers in the UK. We launched in 2019 and we're part of UVW, a campaigning grassroots union that includes facilities, hospitality, legal, design and cultural, charity and sex workers. Also delighted to say that in the short time SAW has been functioning, our membership has grown outside of London into all regions of the UK, and we now have a growing membership in Scotland. So tying in with the Architectural Fringe this month, we've launched a Scottish SAW branch and intend to host in-person meetings in Scotland on a regular basis to build our network and address local concerns of architectural workers here. So get involved in that if you're local. So by architectural worker, who do we include? Not all of us are architects. Identifying as an architectural worker is about recognising the crucial work that many others in the built environment, including assistants, model makers, visualisers, admin workers, document coordinators, the list goes on. Like few other professions, the business of architecture cultivates individualism. The idea of the hero architect, the elusive genius, still reigns supreme in our professional consciousness. The minority who do make it to directorial positions frequently believe that we live in a meritocracy, that you make your own fortunes, that sex, race, background, or circumstance has no bearing on an individual's power to make it in the industry. COVID-19 has revealed the limitations of individualism more clearly than we've ever seen. Sometimes it's not until we lose something that we learn the value in it. This year we all lost social connections. We lost daily interactions with our friends, colleagues and family. And never before have we been more certain on the dependency of human progress on our connectedness with our peers. SAW actively contests the culture of individualism and breaks down the idea of architects having a higher calling by being inclusive to all workers. As well as decentering the elite identity of the architect, the worker part in architectural worker distinguishes us from practice owners and directors. Crucially, we are not those with the power to hire and fire. As a trade union, members are empowered to change our sector from below by joining together. So by unionising, what is it that we're unlearning? Starting with the concept of competition. In the last year, SAW has witnessed many incidents where employers have made unfair and damaging choices that have disproportionately affected lower paid staff. Without any meaningful accountability, it's tempting to preserve self-interest at the expense of others. There's been a severe lack of worker power in the architectural profession in the UK, the effects of which have contributed to a downward spiral of undercutting fees, competition at the expense of staff, lower working standards and a mental health crisis in the sector. Companies compete against one another for the lowest fee, and the precarity of our jobs encourages workers to compete against their colleagues. The next thing to unlearn is overwork. Overwork is embedded in our office culture, and in fact, when surveyed, most architectural workers believe that the practice they work for would fold if staff stopped working for free. In such cases, the business model is broken from the start, as it's inherently reliant on free labour and exploitation. There's direct and indirect pressure on employees to work extended hours through lunch breaks into evenings at weekends and on a regular basis as deadlines approach. The next thing is understanding our value. Are we good at valuing our work? By far the largest class of global capital assets are property. More than gold, more than oil reserves, more than GDP. The largest economic asset is real estate buildings, the core production of our profession, and we are the primary agents in enabling its inception. Why then are we paid so little? Why do we continue to devalue our skills? And who gets richer as we get poorer? Discrimination and oppression. Consider that when you're working for free, you're complicit in a power structure that forces others to do the same, and our professional standards decline universally. The practice of overwork and the toxic work environment is exclusionary and discriminatory towards certain workers, women, working class, disabled, queer, non-British, white or international workers have a harder time entering the profession or rising within it. The mental health crisis. What do you routinely sacrifice for work? What's the cost of pursuing a career in architecture? When you work that extra late shift, put in crazy long hours and endure sleepless nights from stress, life slips by. How many of you have been forced to prioritise work commitments over social events, time spent with family, or your own personal wants and needs? And finally, the ethics of our work and the impact on communities and environment. From an ethical point of view, the division of labour within architectural offices makes it difficult for workers to speak out against the harmful design proposals that we're working on. Whether it's damaging to the environment, dangerous for construction site workers, or gentrifying neighbourhoods, many of us feel uncomfortable with the impact of the work that we do, let alone refuse to carry it out. Professional ethics charters are not strong enough to protect the world from the damages caused by architecture. The conditions of architectural work and the impact of architectural work are directly linked.
So the issues of architectural work that we want to unlearn are clear. But unlearning is not an individualized project. It's not as simple as saying, I will unlearn exploitation. We need to be careful when talking about unlearning, not to remove our analysis of power from the conversation. Unlearning oppression is not like unlearning biting your nails. It's not simply a bad habit that we've all slipped into unknowingly. How do you unlearn the probation period or your termination? How do you unlearn being bullied at work or being excluded from the profession? Certainly a culture shift is necessary, and it's propped up by some wide-held myths. It's also clear that these myths are man-made, they're taught and they can be unlearned. We're unlearning the culture of secrecy around pay, contracts, working hours and treatment. We're unlearning the idea that nothing can change. We're learning that there is an alternative or many alternatives. We're learning about our rights and also that our rights and legal protections actually aren't good enough. We're unlearning the idea that the RIBA or RAS will come and save us. Their ethical charters and codes of conduct are frequently breached. Ask any worker. We're unlearning the belief in exceptionalism, that you won't be subject to redundancy, overwork, underpay, bullying, or that you'll be able to negotiate a better rate of pay when you go through your review or end up as a director one day. We're learning that your power comes as a collective. Structural change is only possible when we work together. So all of these learnings and unlearnings, they're directed at workers. To bosses, go ahead, please do some unlearning too. That power distinction is important, as Carrie mentioned. All too often, workers are already well aware of the myriad causes and ways of their exploitation they live it, but they may be less informed of what to do about it. Bosses, or those who profit, they're equally well aware of the benefit of having a workforce who are disempowered to demand fair pay and fair working conditions. So as well as unlearning within architectural work, there are also a few myths to bust about unions. So a union is not a third party which sits between workers and employers. Unionising is just when workers join together, identify common problems, demands, and make a strategy to change their workplace. Being part of a union isn't an insurance policy for a rainy day. That doesn't work. Nothing changes. By the time that redundancies are announced, it's usually too late. UVW, our parent union, is also one of a new wave of unions. The focus is on empowering precarious and so-called ununionizable workers through active campaigns. And we're proud to be part of a majority migrant and majority women union. So how does this unlearning happen? It has to be positional and collective. We have to first recognize power dynamics in order to reconstruct them together. In SAW, one of the primary ways we practice unlearning is through worker solidarity. That's collective casework and workplace organising. Learning your rights is the first step. We share knowledge with each other about employment rights, legal standards around furlough, discrimination, redundancy. We do this in a collective casework setting, forming solidarity groups between workers from different workplaces around a live issue. It could be as varied as disability discrimination, COVID-safe offices, visa issues, unpaid overtime, or stress at work. So in practice, we're unlearning one form of elitism. You don't need to be a legal professional to exercise your legal rights. We all have the knowledge and skills. Workers take on representation for other workers, letter writing, research, and leverage. Our lived experience is also an invaluable resource. How one group of members have strategized around, say, workplace harassment in the past can be shared and built on. So we have some legal rights, around a maximum working week or minimum wage, but these baseline legal standards, they're just not good enough. These minimum entitlements can only be enforced and bettered by workers themselves coming together in their workplaces and across the sector. Such strategies differ from advocacy or awareness campaigns. What will it take to end unpaid overtime, to end exploitation, to improve wages, to address the pay gap, to work on more ethically sound projects? There's no third-party regulator that will hold our bosses to account. Workers in every office and studio must be empowered to do so. There are already laws and regulations that prohibit discrimination or minimum pay, and yet such breaches still happen. Workplace organising is the most effective way to begin this process. And you can start by finding out how your colleagues are feeling about their work. How are they doing? How have they been affected by the pandemic? What do they want to change? Talk to them. This directly challenges so much of our working culture of individualism. Workplace organising means building strong networks of workers who can form collective demands and take collective action. That's the most direct form of unlearning competition that I can think of. It's key that demands and actions for change are collective. In one workplace, a worker might be driven to settle for a discrimination claim. Well, good for them after a tough situation, but the workplace remains oppressive. Or a worker might individually negotiate a pay rise, matching their white male counterparts. But unless this is coordinated, the pay gap across the office remains unchallenged. Similarly, speaking out individually and asking for better isn't possible for everyone. Maybe you'll be reprimanded and penalised, or maybe you'll simply be ignored. Change, therefore, depends on high participation. That's not to say that we only focus on issues that directly affect a majority. Jane McAlevey, US Labour organiser, talks of expanding the workers' self-interest. You extend from their immediate sphere of concern to issues that affect teammates, colleagues, out to their neighbourhood, city, and far, far beyond. Workplace issues like underpay are intrinsically linked to systems of environmental destruction and socially destructive work. This means standing firmly together to build a more sustainable future for an industry that no longer tolerates elitism, exploitation, and low working standards. It's about imagining alternatives together. How would you change your workplace? So unionising is prefigurative. We're dreaming about and practicing a very different way of working, and by extension, a very different world, one based on cooperation, not exploitation.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Yasmin. I was a bit kind of,
Kerry's
was Kerry coming back? Sorry, Kerry, no problem.
Sorry, I was on mute.
That's all right, come back in, Kerry.
Just to conclude on all of that, The power of collectivism and the problems of an individualised society have never been so visible. The virus has revealed what was there already. It's stripped bare the bankruptcy of our social values in the profession and in our governance generally. We're over a year on now from the outbreak of the pandemic, and the political space we're occupying is a defining moment in history. We've collectively experienced a global unifying crisis, one that's forced us to critically assess our lives and unlearn our practices. The absurd reality of our societal structures confront us each day. You can hang out with your friends, but only with a Scotch egg. You can employ people to decorate your home, but you can't visit your mother. How can there be any doubt now, given the events of the last year, that change isn't possible, that change isn't the only thing that's certain? How can there be any doubt that the systems under which we operate and conform to are self-imposed and malleable? We must recognise our situational opportunity to become more socially active. Prior to COVID, the normal, the legitimacy of the system under which we operated was already under question. 2020 was a year of political activism, a space where we witnessed people come together in multiple shows of solidarity to question and challenge our thinking, whether it was Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, Safer Streets, or here in Glasgow with anti-immigration protests. We've seen too the successes in trade union reform for gig economy workers, Uber, Amazon, foster care workers, sex workers and cleaning staff, all improving their employment rights by taking action together. Now is the time to reassess. Let's agree that there can be no return to the old normal and that the onus is on us to determine what the new normal might look like. Some may consider this idea naive or fanciful. To those we say, understand your power, learn from others in the world around you and build hope and legitimacy in a brighter alternative. Our work in the construction industry is of huge social and financial value. If we were to withdraw our labour or even refuse to work unpaid overtime, within a week, our profession would change beyond recognition. Moves like these are not unprecedented. And in Scandinavian countries, all architects belong to union movements, and their pay, standard of living, and the built environment are all the better for it. So we leave you holding fast to the belief that change is possible, and with the message that hope is not passive. Have the courage to participate, to question, to unlearn, and to set the standard by working with your colleagues supportively and collectively to imagine better. There's never been a more exciting time to be part of the profession, and it's up to us to determine its future. Finished.
Thanks, Kerry. And sorry for interrupting there. And I actually thought I was a bit late coming in because I was so enraptured with what Ska was saying. So apologies for that. And I mean, I think the fact that systems are malleable seems to be kind of going around in my mind. And the example of the last year is very powerful in terms of what you're talking about. So I think, again, there are certain items there that I'd love to come back to in the discussion. And thank you so much. And I think we're going to pass over to Joss now for a question for you both.
Yeah, really fantastic. Thank you so much. I learned a lot and also was really energized by what you were saying. I think one of the things that we do in Disordinary Architecture is we ask people to think about their own bodies and what the ideal architectural body is, and then what they assume about disabled body. Then everybody, when we talk about what it is to be an architect, this thing about overwork, about requiring a certain sort of obsessiveness, the kind of it just pours out of, particularly Part 3 students, kind of pours out. So, you know, as you know, this is a really deep problem. I know you've been talking really coherently about workplace organising and campaigning and the things we can do in that field. I guess I'm almost going to pass on to you the question that Tumpa asked me, which is, in terms of, you know, rethinking practice itself, what you're really doing fantastically is engaging with the problems with it as it is. But in terms of models of good practice or something, you know, it might be external. There was a question related to, or a comment related to, you know, the real estate industry, and, you know, whether there are challenges to that too, whether, I guess, separately, whether there's just something you think is like, it could be like this.
Really good question, Joss. I think there's lots of examples of, maybe I hesitate to say perfect practice, but definitely better practice, whether that's cooperatives or collectives or employee managed trusts. But yeah, I think there's always a risk there. Unless we kind of overhaul the whole thing, then there's always going to be kind of exceptions to the rule that we can kind of hold up and say, oh, but they can have it, while kind of still ignoring the fact that the majority of people who work in architecture, that's not their day-to-day working environment, that's not their day-to-day reality. And yeah, I guess the focus that I have is to try and, if we all kind of change where we are, then we can maybe try and get to where we want to be. But yeah, I don't know, Carrie, what do you think?
It's hard to know what the perfect structure of a practice might be, but I certainly take a lot of inspiration from the kind of societal models very close to home, whether it's in Scandinavia or even Ireland, where people have much better relationships with work and much better pay for what the skills that they've acquired. And I think that's, the main focus on the ground just now, to just improve conditions in the UK and our relationship with our jobs. But that perfect elusive structure, I don't know what it is yet. Yeah,
and it is so tied up with funding, like what you mentioned, Joss, about the technical aid centres, yeah, like doing work that's like for the community, that isn't kind of secretly funded by a developer or a meanwhile use or something. Like that's a whole other part of the puzzle, and yeah, really important to focus on that as well.
Thank you all. That's really interesting. And I think there's a couple of things, is the market becoming worker driven in terms of actually the last year? And I think we might want to return to that. I think there's, as I said, there's some really interesting things to pick up, especially what Joss said there as well, tying it into her talk. So I think that's fantastic. So I'm going to pass over now to Tumpa, our last provocateur.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Can you see my screen? Yeah.
We can, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me at the Architecture Fringe. I'm delighted to be here and very inspired by the previous speakers and their response to unlearning practice. So my name is Tumpa Husna Yasmin Fellows. Just a little introduction of who I am and why I'm here. So yeah, I'm a trained architect and practicing architect. I'm also an educator. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Westminster. I'm a co-founder of the Practice Our Building Design, which is basically which is an interdisciplinary practice between various disciplines, and the architectural services that we provide places people and community at the heart of the practice and our projects. And I'm also a co-founder, and I run a charity called Mannan Foundation Trust, which provides architectural services for disadvantaged communities internationally. I'm the founder of FAME Collective. FAME Collective stands for Female Architects of Minority Ethnic. And the reason for starting this collective is it's come out of my own experience of discrimination because of my gender and my race in the profession. And we are a very new collective. We're less than a year old, but we already have over 1,000 followers and a huge number of volunteers for this, because there is an urgent need for collectives such as this. Although we're based in London, but our followers are from around the world who are also, they can resonate with the experiences that we're also experiencing in the profession. So what is FAME Collective? Our aim is to raise awareness of the barriers, inequality and lack of diversity in architecture and the built environment, and to demand change that responds to our collective challenges. FAME Collective is a research-based network founded to support women of diverse backgrounds and ethnicity in architecture and the built environment. Our continuous research, which is supported by the RIBA funding, research fund, is basically is responding to an urgent need to understand how race and gender affect established and young practitioners, and also students studying architecture from diverse backgrounds and knowledge. The way we conduct the research is through the practice of conversations, through learning or understanding people's lived experiences. And we aim to continue breaking down the barriers of the profession and in education through our research project. So our first, sorry, just to say why I've got this slide up, our first event was titled Exposing the Barriers in Architecture, and it was hosted by Architecture Foundation, where so we have a series of public events where we invite a number of quite well-known people to come and speak to us about how they navigated through the profession and how they navigated through the barriers that they faced in their profession. And also the very important part of our public events is that we open it up to the audience. We have small breakout rooms where we facilitate conversations to hear stories of the participants. I'm not going to read out all these, but I thought it was important to highlight some of the voices that we heard during some of the issues that we've heard during our storytelling session of our public events. So someone said, my view about the barriers and what we can do is inspire confidence and have role models and people who look like us. Then they'll believe that there is a seat at the table for them when they finish. Another person said, through these conversations with many like ourselves, we realize that there are systemic issues that hold us back, whether in education or in practice of architecture. Visibility is one of the key things. You can't be what you can't see. So if you see nobody at the top who represents you, you won't want to be there. Some barriers are hidden for a long time until somebody raises them. And there's some statistics highlighted by one of our speakers. Our IBA members are overwhelmingly white at 85%, as is RIBA Council at 75%. You see a poor representation of Asians in the council at 5%. It's great that we have 20% Black people in the council, but we need to think about other groups which are not represented fairly. So from part 1 to part 3, you'll see that all of the minority groups are dropping out. And this is from RIBA's research that we found these statistics, except the white students who increased from 59.8% at part 1 to 89.7% at part 3. Black students at part 1, 6.4% at part 1 to 2.7% at part 3, and Asian students at part 1, 6.8% at part 1 and 1.5% to part 3. So yeah, so these are quite scary statistics that we found that there is a loss of talent as you go from part 1 to part 3. So our architectural profession has historically been quite, white male dominated. So which is not only evident in our practice, but it's also evident in our education and in academia. And also that within our cities that we live in, which are built to welcome particular identities and exclude others. Fame Collective has been addressing this through a series of public events and participatory research methods to examine the impact of racism, injustice, inequality that contribute to the barriers in architecture and the built environment. So I mentioned about the first event and the speakers and also the participants. So a question that we have asked ourselves, how do we break the barriers in our profession and emphasize some of the diverse role models that are often overlooked. So that then led to our second public event, which was titled Pathways to Success in the Built Environment. So through our recent event, Pathways to Success in the Built Environment, hosted by the NLA, we celebrated the successes of women of ethnic minority in the built environment and exposed the barriers they faced through narrative of their lived experiences, sharing their pathways to success and the challenges they have overcome in their careers and in academia, exploring the diverse pathway that they have navigated and became successful. So through this lens, we also reviewed at this event the systemic inequality in our built environment, in our planning system, and explored the routes to ensure the successes of people, place, and projects by examining the following questions. So in the aftermath of COVID-19, how can practice of architecture enable the voices of underrepresented in our communities to address inequality and to consider social values of places, buildings, and neighborhood? I'm going to move on to the other aspect of unlearning practice. I wanted to quickly touch on unlearning pedagogical practice. And I wanted to speak a bit about how I teach and how I attempt to decolonize the teaching of architecture. So I've posed some of these questions that I've discussed to my students at the University of Westminster at the Architectural Design Studio to explore the role of a designer in addressing racial, spatial, and climate injustice. So during COVID-19 pandemic, the students were encouraged to explore a corner of London, which through community engagement and by being on the ground, and to really question and to ask questions and to through practice of ethnography, understand some of the issues the communities were facing due to COVID-19 as a way of responding to the pandemic. So currently I'm working with Southwark's regeneration team as an advisor, communicating the findings from the research-led teaching, the issues of environmental injustice, social inequalities faced by the local communities in these parts of London. The students are collaborating with Southwark to review the systemic inequality in the built environment and planning policies and the system. And the students are facilitating that voice of those that they reach out to in the communities who are usually underrepresented in planning meetings or meetings with the local authorities. So my pedagogy uses design and practice as an active agent of socio-spatial decolonization and environmental and spatial justice, framed by the following key research questions. How can architecture enable the voices of underrepresented communities to enable spatial and environmental equity? So in this slide and the next slide, these are some images of the two case study projects in two areas of London. In these areas of London, the impact of environmental crises are disproportionately affecting the low-income communities. Majority are from Black and Asian and ethnic minority background that are living in high-risk areas. So the low income communities living in social housing bordering the main roads of these areas form a barrier protecting the more affluent housing from high level of pollution. The low income communities have higher exposure rate to air pollution, and studies have revealed that this leads to reducing life expectancies amongst these communities. So the other thing I wanted to basically talk about in terms of unlearning practice is our projects in Bangladesh. So we provide architectural practices, and this is all voluntary service to disadvantaged communities internationally. And so this project is through London Foundation Trust and our building design. And it's a building project. Initially, it wasn't a building project. It was more community participatory projects to understand the need of the community. And then the charity had responded with this project, which basically facilitates a safe space for the women in a remote village called Rajapur village in Bangladesh. The way we, just to mention that this is a women's literacy and community healthcare building. So the building is used to, not just for women, but also for healthcare for the community. And the methods that we've used in order to engage the community and encourage participation, one of the methods we've used was through making. So when we used orthographic drawings, architectural drawings, we realized that actually hindered participation in this village, because people didn't really engage with, people didn't understand and engage with drawings like that. So the way to design with local crafts people was to actually use the craftsmanship. And we also realized that having formal meetings with the community hindered participations from more underrepresented communities, such as the women in the village, because it's usually the man who represents the household and who basically talks on behalf of the rest of the family. So in order to overcome that, we worked with the women. We realized that they had a special skill in building with earth, with mud. So we wanted to learn from them. And so we hosted these series of workshops to understand how to build with earth, which kind of had given voice and power to the women to make design decisions of the building. And also we hosted other local material workshops to understand the local building materials, which encourage participation. Yeah, so these are our finished project photos, and the building has been handed over to the community because they have taken ownership of it, and they're running the projects of women's literacy classes and the healthcare for the community. And some of the impacts of this project is that some of the women who have graduated from our classes are able to start their business and start their own income on tailoring. So yeah, so to summarize this project, the aim of the Rajapur Center was established as a facility for healthcare and literacy in the Rajapur village, using participatory co-design methods and local materials and skills, using the design and construction as an educational device in itself. And through those participation, we understood the environment and the extreme climate of the site, and understood how to respond to it by the knowledge that already exists in the indigenous community that respond to extreme climate. The aim was also to study and enable local design responses to environmental challenges at the forefront of unpredictable, fast-changing climate, and to share and discuss its findings both locally and internationally to the communities. So yeah, I think I'm gonna stop there.
Fantastic, thank you, Tumpa. I don't know whether you were going to let your video play out there, so I didn't want to jump in. That's fantastic, thank you. So there's a question from Kerry and Aska for you, so we'll move straight on to that.
Thank you, Tumpa. That was really lovely. Some amazing illustrations there from those projects. And our question to you really is that the public events that Fame Collective have hosted demonstrate all too clearly that Black, Asian and minority ethnic women architects are acutely aware of the issues that they face in an oppressive and exclusionary sector. So what kind of power do you generate by coming together as a community with these shared experiences and shared demands?
Thank you. Well, I think I guess the power is that we empower each other. That's the most important thing about Fame, is that when we come together and we feel comfortable to voice our experiences and our grievances, and especially during COVID-19, we heard a lot of stories which showed that the experiences of Black and Asian women, in ethnic minority women in the profession, their struggles have exacerbated during the COVID-19. They were the first one to be made redundant, or first one to be sort of excluded from a lot of the decision making in the practice. So we heard a lot of stories which we felt empowered when we could share it with each other, and we also felt that we also feel that the more voices, the larger the number is, something that you guys have mentioned. I think the stronger or the louder our voices are, and so we are more powerful in addressing the systemic challenges in the profession. So I guess, yes, to answer the question, I think the most important thing is that we support one another and we empower one another. That's more important than raising awareness, I think, and to give confidence to especially the next generation of women who are going into the profession. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. I mean, we've covered so much ground there across a range of topics. I think it's it's hard to almost delve straight into a discussion with everyone. So I think we'll maybe start out in a certain direction, and we'll keep an eye on the chat, and if anyone has any questions from the room, please come in, and we'll take them, and we'll move around the panel. So just to start us off, I think, entering into the discussion, something actually that UVW mentioned was essentially following the call for unlearning in this roundtable series. Who needs to do the unlearning? So I actually posed this question earlier today, and I wanted to start off the discussion with it because really it's been touched on a little bit during the presentations this evening about hierarchies and actually understanding unlearning. But who needs to do the unlearning? Joss, I'm going to go to you first, and we can move around, and then we'll throw it out to the audience as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think, I mean, in a way, what's really interesting, talking about coming at this from working with a lot of disabled artists, is in the end, the unlearning there is non-disabled people. It's the privilege of not having to think about those things. Just as a white woman, it's the privilege of me not having to think about the experience. If I can avoid thinking about the differential experiences of Black and ethnic minority women, of trans and queer people, I can just waft past all that, and added to that, probably everybody, all of us that are in this room are already in a position of privilege. If we've studied architecture or we're studying architecture, that already puts us in a place way, even if we're struggling in practice, still way beyond the day-to-day life of many people. So yes, it's a really good question, because yes, the unlearning is the people who already have the privilege, and that's what's been so brilliant, I think, about the Black Lives Matter movement. And what we need is that continuing momentum, that we each take responsibility for our own privilege and act on that in not on behalf of, but together with and in support of women and others who are being endlessly are the ones who don't fit, who are put in this misfit category and then blamed for it.
Yeah, I think it links really well to your description of fitting, and I keep coming back to that, but it feels like it cuts across quite a lot of the topics this evening. Tumpa, how about yourself? From Fame's position, who needs to do the unlearning?
I'm gonna agree with Joss in the sense that I think it's myself as well. I've got to unlearn, a lot of the ways that I found when I was practicing, when I had graduated. I had 10 years of practice behind me, but I had to unlearn a lot of the things I've learned in practice and in education in order to practice in Bangladesh, for example, in order to encourage community participation, for example. Those are the things I wasn't taught at school, at university. So, and then also in terms of responding to all the stories that we hear through fame, you know, the obvious answer is that the practices, those in higher managerial positions who sometimes actually have no idea that things are happening in the practice, and so much discrimination is happening, but they're not aware. And I think it's you know, learning how to tackle with the fact that they're unaware. You know, what is it that they have to learn in order to make themselves aware of the position that we find ourselves, you know, the position that I found myself, where I had been made redundant, or where I had been, I felt unfairly made redundant, or, you know, missed out on the promotion, and someone much younger and with less experience, but happened to be white, was put forward. You know, all those things, I mean, it's still happening. It's still happening in 2021. And how, you know, what do we do about it? We can talk about it. We talk about this in platforms such as Fame. So I have a lot to learn about how we respond to those stories. And one way we're trying to do that is through this research project. And it's good to have the RIBA back us up, but at the same time, I think far more needs to be done by the RIBA in order to, you know, in order to address the issue like they're starting to do with the climate change. But I don't think enough has been done to address the issue of racism in the profession. So yeah, I think, yeah, it wasn't a direct answer. Sorry.
No, it's a hard, I mean, it's a hard question, and I think, you know, it's challenging as well. And I think it's really, I completely agree. It's fantastic that the RIBA are obviously supporting the research you're doing, and the RIS has a long way to go, and there's no doubt about that. And I think every day, you know, there is something new to uncover, and I suppose there is an element of education that runs through this, and awareness, which has run through what everyone's mentioned tonight, that's at a different level than just, I think someone referenced the code of conduct. It's way beyond, and I think we are moving into that area of discourse, which is starting to percolate a little bit, but it's not quite there. And I think it is good that the professional bodies are supporting, but I think there can be a push from that side as well. So I mean, I could get into, there's loads of things I'd love to go into here, but I'm not going to totally take over with that direction. So I mean, this is going to put you in a really awkward position, Kerry and Asker, but I'm going to ask your question back to you in terms of who needs to do the unlearning from your perspective.
I'll go for it. I'm kind of cheating because Aska already answered the question in the discussion earlier, but for us, it's workers that need to unlearn. Crucially, it's this kind of revelation understanding of you know, selling your labour and what that's worth, and also this recognition of your behaviours as potentially being individualistic. What is it that you're married to in terms of an ideology within the profession? Is it that architecture is a calling? Is it that we dissociate ourselves from other workers, like the administration staff that are in the office, or the cleaning staff? You know, we have more in common with them than we do our bosses. So for me, my answer to that is that it has to come from the kind of critical mass in the industry, which is the practicing architects, architectural assistants, and other workers.
It wouldn't naturally be a go-to as well, because you'd often think it would have to happen top down to set an example. So I think that in itself is a really strong message. So just whilst you're on the screen, Gary, sorry, there was a question that came in on the chat actually from Neil Maguire. So, and I think that yourself and Asker would be great to kind of respond first. So the question is, do you think the relationship between unions and the Labour Party is broken? And how can we use unions and unionising to get better political representation? And should that really be a focus?
So I don't really want to touch too closely on the connection between unions and the Labour Party, but certainly lots of people within unions and or outside of unions feel the sense of betrayal that they're not represented by the Labour Party or other parties. But yeah, I guess not to focus any attention really on the Labour Party at all, but I think that politics should be local, and politics happens in community groups and trade unions and can shape what happens at a neighbourhood or a city or larger scale of space. And I think that's where our energy is best placed.
That was well answered, and I think it's difficult in terms of politics are used in so many different ways that it's when you're trying to talk about those relationships, it's not in such a direct manner. So I think that was very well answered, Asker. Thank you. And I suppose if anyone else has got any questions from the audience and they want to pop them in the chat, we can throw them around the panel and really get into discussion about them. So please, don't be shy. Just pop your question in the chat. I can't actually see everyone on my screen, otherwise I would say pop your hand up. But if please just pop anything into the chat and we'll have a discussion about it. So just to go back to the question we asked at the beginning about one thing you would change, there's been some really interesting kind of submissions on the chat around that. One is there a way to decouple or reconfigure architecture's relationship with capital and the real estate system, which Josh touched on actually? Could that be linked to ideas like universal basic income? I think there's some really interesting ideas there that have come through, certain talks this evening, which it's really, really interesting. We also have from Lily Whitehouse, the competitive culture between practices. So I'm going to put this to you, Tumpa. Sorry, is there anything you think we can do around the competitive culture between practices, and how do you feel about that?
In practice or in between practices?
I think it's between practices themselves.
Okay. Well, I always wondered why we're allowed to undercut one another in fees, for example. So, why we don't have solidarity between practices, between practitioners, to come together and decide on how we can protect our services through one sort of agreed amount fees per services, or for example. I've always wondered why that is, where I always felt like the competitiveness is not just through the idea of who's the most creative, it's also about who is able to undercut. I found, especially for smaller practices, that it becomes very cutthroat in terms of who can do less, charge less for more work, and then that has a domino effect, a consequence to those who are in the office, who are probably forced to do unpaid work in order to meet that really underpaid, getting fees that is so low. So yeah, I mean, one reason why there isn't a sense of collectiveness or working together could be because of people's ego, and because some people think that being it's just as their personality. But I don't believe that this is what architecture school teaches us. I don't believe that. I just think that it's something that we learn when we're also in practice. It's something that we think that's the way to be successful if we are like this to one another, even between our colleagues, even, who can get promoted first, and there's that sort of competition to jump forward and kind of step on each other's toes. And I just think it's toxic and it's horrible. And unfortunately, it does exist, and I have experienced it, and it's still like that in practice. Yeah.
I mean, it'd be interesting almost if we could see everyone here to ask who identifies with that. And I don't want to preempt the answer, but I think we wouldn't be surprised. And it actually relates to something that Zoe Rigg has mentioned in the chat as well, in terms that actually wishes that overworking, or the one change would be that overworking is necessary within the architectural practice to either keep your job or progress your career. And actually, Tumpa, just going back to your point there, obviously you said that with regards to competitiveness between practices, but also in terms of job security in relation to the work and the narrative coming through fame. You know, I think it's across the board. And I don't know, obviously, UVW have touched on the kind of workers' rights in that regard. Joss, I don't know anything in your experience and kind of working with students. Do you have any comments on that with regards to overworking and that kind of machine-driven aspect of architecture that seems to still exist?
Yeah, I mean, we've actually, not with the teaching I'm doing at the moment, which is slightly different, but when I've been teaching studio, one of the things we've explored, which we did at the University in Manchester, was what is it that you need to do in order to do a good project? And what is that? And how much is a kind of obsessiveness of working all hours of the night or day, of being seen to produce huge amounts of work? What is how much of that is of value? What is it that, in a way, what is the least you can do? What is it you need to do to make a good project? And are those things different? And on the basis that actually they are different, that it's kind of just inexorable. And I know Tumpa was saying in some ways there's a difference between the pressures in practice, but I think that it does start in education, that you do. There's always an assumption that you will throw an all-nighter, that you will, you'll have just so much work on the wall. And often that's repetitive work. It's the same thing shown in lots of different ways. So I think there are, I mean, going back to thinking about what needs to change, I think it would be really interesting to do an architectural project which is not about the sheer quantity of work that's produced, and actually talks about what it is that makes a project. And I think that somebody mentioned a kind of ethical agreement that was about between architects, but I think a kind of contract, a kind of ethical or code of ethical conduct in a design studio would be really interesting, that you explicitly talked about those things. There are variations of that, but I think that's one of them. I guess the other thing I just wanted to say, it's absolutely essential, the kind of workers' rights, the work that UVW-SAW are doing. But one of the things that I think was really interesting for me about Matrix was the bridging there was very much across with the construction industry. And I now work in a real estate setting, so I'm really interested in what the bridges are with real estate and how you might rethink value in real estate. So it's not to always extend the problem and say, oh, we should also look at this, and we should also look at this, because that's one way of actually preventing concrete action. I think it's very easy to get into that pattern. But I do think that architecture as a profession is very insular, and that part of the way that it goes on reproducing itself is very inward looking. It's kind of endlessly, oh, well, maybe if we did this. And I feel extending out to women in the manual trades, extending out to I mean, as already happens, but to people who are really trying to rethink the real estate industry and thinking about where those overlaps are. I mean, I can afford to do that. I'm in an academic situation, but it's just an overall comment about needing to look at ourselves, but also recognizing that we do get very inward. Yeah,
very much so, and I think it's a very good point. I'd like to, because I can see and know Akiko, I'm wondering if you would pop your mic off, Akiko, and elaborate a little bit on the point you made in the chat, if you wouldn't mind. I'm putting you on the spot. I'm bringing you into the room.
That's okay. Switch my right mic on. Yeah, sorry, I typed that up quite early on when I was actually thinking about what we need to unlearn and relearn societally. And I think that idea was specifically prompted by, I think it was Kerry's mention of architects in Sweden belonging to unions and joining together. Actually, in Sweden, and I'm talking from family experience, I've got relatives live in Stockholm. Sweden generally, societally, has a really, really high rate of people belonging to any kind of group. So tenants associations, for example, and recreational things as well, like choirs, you know, your kind of neighborhood choir. So my comment is generally about participation. And I feel like in my practice, I've seen so much hopelessness and people feeling like, what's the point of taking part? We've got no power to do anything about it. That's actually someone else's job to sort that out for ourselves, for us. So, sorry, it's not directly related to practice. I think my practice experience is probably a bit different to the mainstream as well. So I've got lots of other thoughts that maybe I can share another time when it's more specifically relevant.
I think that's really helpful, and it's the collective versus the individualism again, and actually the empowerment through that. So I think it's really relevant, Akiko. And sorry, I picked on you because your camera was on, so I wanted to bring you into the room. But I really appreciate that. And actually, Neil has picked up on your point in terms of, you know, and I suppose it relates to what Joss just said as well. And do we think that often dialogue and education are a barrier to direct empowerment and agency? Mentions that they're not mutually exclusive, but wonders if sometimes dialogue is an excuse for inaction. So really interested to hear more examples of direct action and agency and how these might be amplified. Aska and Kerry, I'm going to put that back to you. I'm conscious of time, but there's a couple of questions that if everyone doesn't mind hanging on, I'd really like to cover. So Aska and Kerry, can I throw that to you?
Maybe I could address Akiko's point first and then Aska if you can come in on some of what Neil's saying. I find that so relatable, Akiko, that idea of hopelessness, and it's something that we talk about in SAW meetings endlessly. Some of the barriers that we find to organising, in fact, the main ones include apathy and fearfulness, this feeling that nothing will ever change, which is why we try to emphasise the point of you know, nothing being in a permanent state. And fear that you might lose your job if you speak up, which is why, again, we emphasise this collectivism, because there's protection within that. So it's something that we try to train ourselves on, and that can come down to skills and how to have a specific type of conversation with someone to activate them and make them feel they can participate in a more meaningful way. So anyone that's feeling hopeless in your practice, get them in touch with us. And I'll give over to Aska for the next bit.
Yeah, so to touch on Neil's point about dialogue being a barrier to direct empowerment, that resonates with yeah, an ongoing case in SAW. So a member and her colleagues who are also members, she was invited to take part on their sort of internal company wellbeing group after she kind of complained about things like pay gaps and yeah, all sorts of workplace problems, and some of which related to mental health. So the wellbeing group sometimes, well, then became this kind of real kind of the employer can say, we're addressing the problem, we've got the wellbeing group, but they set the terms of that conversation, and they set the framework of, you know, how far can you kind of question outside the wellbeing group. They also set the time frame for that, so how often does the wellbeing group meet. So I think I get what you're saying, Neil, about you know, dialogue sometimes stalling kind of more direct change, and it's really frustrating.
Thank you both. I mean, does anyone have any other examples of that direct action and agency and how they could be amplified? Just throwing it out to Tumpa and Joss as well. Sorry, putting everyone on the spot.
That's all right. Well, basically, when we host our public events, we would very much like there to be a dialogue between men and women, and we, through our social media campaign, we try to encourage a dialogue and you know, an engagement with men, but we always find that only a handful of men attend our events. So yeah, so there's a definite disconnect between these conversations of the issues that those who attend the FAME events are facing with those who are not facing the, you know, those challenges. And we would really like to address that for our next event. We'd really like to engage with more men to have conversations with, and also to have a dialogue. So yeah, there's definite disconnect at the moment. That's what we found at FAME.
That's really interesting. Joss, hand it over to you.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I think there's a lot of really good work, and I think of Sarah Ahmed, around how dialogue is used as a way of consolidating power, that there are ways of using it which do just perpetuate the way that things are. And the institutions are very good at that. They kind of have ways of appearing to be open and interested in participation, but actually aren't. And I think that there are also many participatory methods that are very explicitly designed not to do that. And I think, I mean, Disordinary Architecture has been going, you know, everybody's got some examples of things that work well, but we've been going since 2008, and we now work directly with some architectural practices who are really definitely changing the way they work, in the way that their processes work, in the language they use, in the range of ways in which they engage with rethinking access and inclusion, not just around disability, but and so I think, you know, a positive thing for me in the current situation is there are places of real commitment to change, and those are, they include dialogue, but they're also about actual recognizable change at the level of the organization. And I think I can think of a couple of practices we've worked with, in one case where we've really had to push, and in the other where the practice is just, you know, rolling ahead, doing fantastically thoughtful work in all sorts of ways. And it's, so I think there are, it's not an either or, there is good participation and bad participation, and we need to find the ones that work.
I wonder if there's a way as well of, you know, it's the redefinition of what an award is in architecture, or what we celebrate in architecture. And I think there's an unpicking of that culture as well, to actually celebrate what's making a difference and what's actually, like you say, you know, I don't want to say best practice, but, you know, people who are taking something and really rolling with it and kind of pushing that boundary. And I think sometimes what we celebrate as architects needs to be unlearned. And as, you know, again, it fits into the role model category, it fits into what the public look up to and at in terms of architecture, and cuts across, you know, quite a lot of the topics we've spoken about. So sometimes I think, you know, even the fundamentals of how the profession as a whole works, everything's so interlinked. Again, I'm very aware of time, but there is one more very good open note, essentially, that maybe we can have a quick discussion on. I'd really love to, if people will stay with us for another 5 minutes. So this is from Craig, and mentions that issues identified tonight are embedded issues in a global economic system. Can action at a scale influence the model and result in a fundamental realignment? Hopefully so. And asks if we can discuss it. So I'll briefly go around the panelists, and we can kind of comment. So Asker and Kerry, I'll come to you first again.
That's a big question, Craig. And I'd like to think that action at sort of many small scales, but joining up to be a bigger scale, if that makes sense, is how we're going to get there. And I thought to just jump on another point in the chat and linking back to Akiko's point about Scandinavia and Lizzie's point about kind of public demanding better design. I think one of the real keys to that sort of structural change, is about kind of community groups. It's about getting together with other people, forming shared demands and being able to articulate them, put pressure on the people who have power. And that's how we're going to get there.
Kerry, do you want to jump in as well, or are you leaving Asker to it?
No more to add, yeah, perfect.
Tumpa, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, so I think our biggest challenge is, as I mentioned, we'd really like to work with men actually to make a change, because we feel that as well as working with those in power in order to address our challenges, we also want to have like-minded people, men or women of any race or any color, collectively to address our challenges together. So I think it's about basically standing up for what's right and joining forces, whether it be Fame joining with UVW or with JOS, or I think it doesn't matter if you are believing in the same, if you have the same belief and if you think it's a right cause. It's about coming together as a collective with various institutions and organizations working collaboratively together to make a change.
Thanks, Tumpa. And Joss?
I mean, I have a model of how change happens, which other people may not have, although I think it overlaps a lot with Asker, and it is what you want to change. You need a paradigm shift in everyday attitudes, actually. You need the culture, you need people to just think differently and just assume differently. And I think that is often starts from grassroots campaigns. We've got lots of evidence of that, and it's small actions repeated again and again and again until they snowball up through collectives, through local, into a more general view of the world. And for me, a really great example of that is, I mean, we have to keep fighting these things, they fall backwards, but is a kind of attitude to domestic violence. When I was younger, it was kind of just assumed it was fine for women to be beaten up by their partners or their husbands. And the kind of women's refuge movement was part of just a whole, that just women just fought for spaces to protect women, to give somewhere for escape for people facing domestic violence. Those spaces were used, more spaces were designed, the kind of the sense of this being a huge hidden problem. For me, it just changed attitudes. They may have fallen back, and there's some people whose attitudes aren't changed, but they changed. They explicitly changed. And I think that model of action, which is you just work, you start small and you build and you build and you build, is, I'm a grassroots person. I think that's where you go. You don't try, if you try and kind of say, right, we're going to change the world, you don't get anywhere.
I think that's a very good point, and I think it makes the discussion here this evening even more apt. And I like what Tumpa said in terms of actually, it's bringing together a voice as that collective attitude. I mean, that's what we've done here this evening, so I think that's to be celebrated. And I feel like there's about a 4-hour discussion we could have on about just about every topic we've touched on here, and I hope that we've covered a lot of things in the chat. There were responses to my question as well, which is great, which made everyone think in the room, which is fantastic, and I believe a record will be kept of them. So thank you to everyone for contributing. We've mentioned already this evening about asking the panelists for resources, and just touched on it in the presentation. So we'll actually collate them on the Architecture Fringe Padlet, and then they'll also be available on the transcript from the event as well in a different format. So hopefully we can pull together a list of things that if anyone's interested, they can delve a little further. And there's also been links on the chat to kind of get in touch with people here as well, which is fantastic to see. And I think it's about this being the start of the dialogue. And I think one thing, you know, and Josh touched on it, one thing we are really bad at is we're inward looking, sometimes even in empowered groups. So I think coming together and actually sharing experiences across different grassroots structures is so important as well. So I think just starting off this conversation, as I said, has been fantastic. And I'd like to thank, you know, all our panelists tonight. I'm going to take so much time to process everything from this evening. And I hope that everyone who came along tonight feels the same. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you to you all. So I'll pass back now to Shona and Louisa, who'll tidy things up for the end of the evening. And thank you for staying with us for an extra 10 minutes to wrap up those questions on the chat.
Okay, thank you so much, Christina and everyone. I just also want to reiterate what you've just said and pay a huge thanks to each of our provocateurs this evening, our audience participation and contributions, and facilitation from yourself, which has really helped us navigate many of the intersectional issues facing practice and the industry, and the common theme of the collective. While we see some of these themes are recurring, have been discussed in the past, it's inspiring to see a resurgence of questioning, recognising the need to unlearn, the need for change, and to consider how events or times of disruption, I guess, as we've seen in the last year, may trigger a change in attitude, but how it's also maybe brought us together and enabled us and empowered us to form collectives more easily than we thought before, and we can build on the momentum to bring about a culture of change. It's been a really enriching conversation, and like you said, it could have easily gone on for quite a few more hours. We already had an hour before this meeting too. I hope that everyone else is feeling inspired, and in the words of SCW, change depends on high participation. So thank you all for coming tonight. I'm going to hand over to Lisa now just to tidy things up, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just a little reminder is at the Fringe we're all volunteers. So if you enjoyed the event and would like to support us, if you could visit our Patreon page and donate to allow us to continue our work to our goal of creating a more plural, cultural, critical and accessible community of architectural culture in Scotland. Please also follow us on social media and like and share our posts. And following nicely from what Joss mentioned earlier, we're often focused on looking inward. So please join us again next Wednesday at the same time for Roundtable 2, which will look outwards towards the delivery and output of architecture, where our contributors will be considering how practitioners can think beyond the horizons of traditional practice and consider alternate pathways or disciplines we can learn from to practice architecture in the future. There's also been lots of mention of architectural education in this roundtable. So tying in well with this, we've got an education symposium tomorrow with Missing in Architecture, titled Modes of Travel, Unlearning Education. Tickets for this and other events forming the core programme and open programme can be booked on our website at architecturefringe.com. And yeah, thank you again for coming together tonight, and thank you again to our wonderful contributors. Great, have a great evening, everybody.